there is a wall. There is a wall blocking this country's progress to build Dr. King's beloved community. That vision of all people being able to share in the wealth of the earth. That vision of a world where poverty and hunger and homelessness will not be tolerated because international standards of human decency will not allow it. That vision where racism and all forms of discrimination, bigotry, and prejudice will be replaced by an all-inclusive spirit of sisterhood and brotherhood. Could I turn this off? Thank you. That wall that is blocking this country's progress is named racism. It is the wall of limitations, of unequal treatment of people, of people feared or judged because of the color of their skin, of antagonism between people of different ethnic or national backgrounds. That wall has been here since before this country's founding. That wall braced the belief that people of dark skin do not have souls, that people of white skin are inherently smarter. That wall supported the twisted biblical teachings to say that some people could own other people. That wall braced the belief that some people only counted as 3/5 of a person. Abraham Lincoln faced and dismantled some of that wall with the Emancipation Proclamation. Dr. Martin Luther King and other civil rights leaders faced and dismantled some of the wall, getting the voting rights and equal housing laws passed. But it's still there. It's not gone away. We face it in 2020. Now, I'm not sure that it will ever be dismantled. It's pretty huge and very thick. But at least we can do our part of the work to reduce its size and its shadow in our country. And that's what I'm going to be talking about for the next few minutes this morning. I'm going to talk about one way that we can reduce the shadow of that wall. One way that we can take a chip out of the wall. And the one way that we can take the chip out of the wall, that each of us can take a chip out of that wall to reduce its shadow, is to learn more about and then face the reality of racism in our society. Face the issue of racism in our society that's not been solved by the various legislations. Face the reality of racism in our society without personally shutting down or denying it or excusing it or fearing it or being embarrassed by it or by living willful ignorance of its widespread and true nature. Now, our society has been making headway in dealing with racism over the last several decades. There have been some good strides made in the battle against racial animosity and discrimination. But it seems that animosity and discrimination, or at least the desire to discriminate, is just below the surface of our society, and it has been showing itself more and more in the past few years. We're seeing a renewed vigor to attack initiatives that try to equalize entrance into the workplace or college. Politicians in office or running for office freely make hate-filled racist statements and work to rouse a tribalism mentality among particular groups of people by setting up a sense of scarcity and fear. We hear from the realms of politics and higher education and the coffee shop down the street the claim that being sensitive to the feelings and experiences of other people has taken political correctness too far. Now, these sentiments have been part of our society for decades. But now these ugly expressions seem to be voiced more freely. And one reason this is happening is because for a very long time, many white people have been afraid to really look at how racism has been intertwined in our culture, our school, our work, our churches. And this is because many of us white people, and I include myself in this, many of us white people suffer from the malady of white fragility. White fragility is a condition sociologist Robin DiAngelo describes as the intellectual gymnastics or behaviors of people that are triggered by some kind of mental stress caused by an incident that produces racial dissonance. This racial stress results in responses like anger or fear and guilt, or behaviors such as argumentation and silence or walking out of an event dealing with racism. For other people, racial dissonance results in them employing a psychological defense by emphatically claiming that they and all whites are being victimized, slammed, blamed for things they did not personally do that happened hundreds of years ago, or that politically correct liberals are using them as punching bags. Others take a defensive stand and employ the "I have a black friend" or a black coworker argument, or just out and out refuse to engage in anti-racism education, saying that they don't need such education because they've heard it before or they already know it. The mental racist stress that DiAngelo has identified in her research can come from things like a challenge to a white person's self-perceived objectivity when they are told that their viewpoint comes from a racialized frame of reference, or being placed in an environment where they become socially uncomfortable because people of color talk openly and directly about their racial perspectives of inequality and structural racism. It can come from a sense that their racial solidarity with other white people have been damaged or disappears because a fellow white person does not provide agreement with the individual's interpretation of racial relationships or connections. Or it comes from a challenge to a person's perception of being liberal when they receive feedback that their behavior had a racist undertone or an impact. Or a claim that access is systematically unequal between racial groups, which questions the white culture's notion of meritocracy for all people in this country. Or it comes face to face with a challenge to a person's preconceived notion of what people of color do or how they act. Bryan Stevenson, an attorney and founder of the Equal Justice Initiative, tells of a time, well-known, well-established attorney, tells of a time when he was sitting at the defense table in a courtroom. The judge walked in and harshly told him, "Hey, you shouldn't be in this room without your counsel. Go back out and wait in the hallway until your attorney gets here." To which Stevenson stood up and replied, "Your Honor, I am the attorney on this case." And the reason these kinds of situations cause dissonance and distress is that they are part of the underlying condition of our society that leaves white people unaccustomed to effectively handle issues of race. The first condition of this society is that most white people live segregated lives. Even if you're living intentionally in a mixed neighborhood, generally white people's lives are segregated. And white interests, other than a very few rare settings, white interests and perspectives are almost always central in our society. Because we whites live primarily segregated lives in a white-dominated society, we receive little or very little authentic information about racism and what truly happens to people of color as they navigate through society. So we are unprepared to think critically about our social structures and our perspectives. Second, whites are taught to see their perspectives as being objective and representative of reality. We whites are raised to view ourselves as the universal human who represents all of humankind's experience. White culture in this country is understood to represent humanity and is normative, while people of color are only seen in their racialized minority context. Third, most whites are taught to believe that their success is a result of their own efforts, while ignoring the fact that being white gives us privilege and a step up in almost any situation. This idea that being white has its social privilege is not something that we have been brought up to think about, because truly it is a relatively new look or relatively new understanding of what is racism in this country. In my past, I recall that when I was challenged as being racist by a white facilitator at an anti-racism workshop, I got angry. I got angry and strongly protested being named that. And I used all the defensive tricks to justify myself, like saying, I'm politically liberal. I had pushed for affirmative action initiative years ago in my workplace. I never, ever used the N-word. And I threw in the black friend defense, even embellishing it by saying I had gone to black nightclubs and danced with black women several times in past years. How dare you call me racist? My visceral reaction to the term racist, and I assume of many people, comes from the fact that we have been taught the mainstream definition of racism. The mainstream definition of racism is that racism and the resultant overt and covert kinds of discrimination come from individual racial prejudice. Racism, under this point of view, is a conscious bias held by mean or ignorant people. Therefore, good-hearted, liberal-minded people cannot be racist, because we don't wish ill upon people of color. And while mean and ignorant people do racist things, racism in our culture is more than individual actions. It encompasses economic, political, social, and cultural structures and actions and beliefs that systematize and perpetuate an unequal distribution of privileges, resources, and power between white people and people of color. Ergo, we who benefit from that system that systematically empowers white people are part of the racist arrangement of American culture. Now, white fragility, I believe, is a big cultural problem, because it stands in the way of majority society addressing structural racism. Even white people who consider themselves to be good allies of people of color can be unaware of their racial biases and can get caught up in image self-preservation and not see the underlying issues and the social problems. Now, I'm not sure, as I said, I'm not sure we'll ever be able to tear down that wall across our road to the beloved community. But perhaps if we white people, people like you and like me, can become less fragile when confronted with challenges to our self-image and perspectives, we might be able to help address the structural racism problem in this country. What would this entail becoming less fragile? Well, I think the answer is first to be willing to accept that even in the best liberal mindsets, there lurks elements of racism. Just because the country and the culture in which we have been raised has, from its founding, from the time of the first settlers on this land, been racist. Second, we need to be willing to learn how an action or an inaction can have a racial impact. If something happens that we seem to be called racist, we need to ask the question, I'm sorry, I didn't know what I did was perhaps wrong. Can you tell me? Can you help me understand? And then third, as Dr. King commented or said in his speech, we need to work to dismantle structural racism. So in the coming months, I hope we can all take opportunity to learn about the contemporary racism that will be offered by our Social Action Committee in some programs that they're planning. Yes, it is hard work to dismantle that cultural wall, even to just take a small chip out of it. But shall we take up the challenge that Dr. King laid out, actually in another part of that speech, Don't Sleep Through the Revolution? He said, modern psychology has a word that has become common. It's the word maladjusted. We read a great deal about it, and certainly we all want to live well-adjusted lives and avoid neurotic and schizophrenic personalities. But I must say to you, my friends, there are some things in our nation, in our world, to which I am proud to be maladjusted, and I call upon you to be maladjusted, and all people of goodwill to be maladjusted to these things until the good society is realized. I never intend to adjust myself to discrimination. I never intend to adjust myself to economic conditions that will take necessities from the many and give it as luxury to the few. I never intend to be adjusted to racial discrimination. So shall we, you and I, work in our small ways to better understand ourselves in regard to racism and discrimination, and how we have been a part of it, and then take action to improve ourselves and improve our world on the way to building that beloved community. So be it. Amen.